Welcome to a new episode in the Multiverse video series. Today we're going to learn how to use Amazon EMR with Apache Spark and R. Now, before we get started, I do want to mention that there are multiple cloud providers available for you to choose from. This is the sparklyr.ai website, and it lists some of the different providers that you can choose from. Today we're going to learn how to use Amazon Web Services, specifically Amazon EMR with Apache Spark, but you can also use other providers like Azure, Databricks, Google Cloud, and IBM in the cloud, as well as Google. So definitely there's a lot of options that you can choose from, but as I mentioned, we're going to focus on Amazon EMR for this particular video. So, um, so what do you want to do as a start is to take a look at the RStudio R interface to Spark on Amazon EMR blog post from the AWS Big Data blog. Um, Actually, the easiest way of finding it is simply to go to Google. And within Google, actually just searching for SparklyR EMR. So that's pretty much it. So if you need to find the particular blog post, just search for SparklyR and EMR, and you should be able to hit the blog post quite easily. So this is the blog post, and what motivated me to do this video is, well, first of all, a lot of people have asked for this particular video, and the second one is that this blog post is a little bit out of date, and I've also learned a few tricks and tips that are worth sharing for those of you using EMR. All right, so yeah, so for the most part, we're going to follow the recommendations from this blog post. So as a start, what we want to do is we want to log into our console. So we're go to aws.amazon.com, sign in, and then search for the EMR service. And then from EMR, what you want to do is you want to create a cluster. Now, I usually recommend you create a cluster with the advanced options, and that's what we're going to do. And the first thing to notice is that, in this particular version, there's only one version available of Spark, which is 2.4.4. So the way in which you change versions on EMR of Spark is by changing the version of actually EMR. But we want to use the recommended version, which is EMR for 5.29 at the recording of this video. I actually did try it also using the latest version, EMR 6.0, which just came out of beta. And I hit a couple issues on the script where it wasn't properly installing R, which I'm pretty sure they're fixable, but they will require more work than what we're going to do in this getting started video using EMR. All right, so we want to select the default version of EMR, and we don't need most of the services, so we can deselect them. We do need to select Spark to be installed in this particular cluster. Now, the other setting that it's quite optional, but I usually recommend using it at least when for my personal use of Amazon clusters. I believe is named Maximize Resource Allocation. So actually for this particular setting, it's part of a JSON configuration file. So what I usually do is just search for the setting, which is Maximize Resource Allocation. And there's usually an example which we can copy paste and use. And mostly what could happen when you set up a Spark cluster in EMR is that EMR tries to be a little bit conservative on what resources it makes available to Spark. So for instance, if you only have like one node with 8 CPUs, EMR might only assign to Spark 6 CPUs. And I personally enjoy having control of the entire resources, which I found out that this particular setting can be quite useful to letting us maximize the resources. Yeah, so this would be the first step. As the second step, we are basically selecting how many machines do we want our Spark cluster to be initialized with. We definitely need a master node. That's hopefully obvious, but you can have none or as many worker nodes as you might need. You can ask for 100 or 1,000. I One of the things that I did notice is the first time that I try to request 100 nodes is that by default, or at least in my account, Amazon locked me, and I wasn't able to create a cluster with that many machines. I had to open a support ticket requesting additional machines. Now, for this particular video, we're gonna keep it simple and not have any worker nodes, mostly because I want to focus on the installation process. I usually enjoy also selecting at least 8 cores for the master node, mostly because there's a lot of packages that need to be compiled when using R, so it makes things a little bit faster. Um, Now, this third step is the interesting step, mostly because we need to configure a Bootstrap action, and the Bootstrap action that we're going to use is the one that the AWS blog recommends using to configure Spark with R. However, I do recommend you create your own script and make modifications. So let's convert this to a proper URL by adding .s3 and copy all of these. And then you can basically edit this script on whichever favorite text editor you have at hand. And what I recommend doing here is look for the installation of RStudio. And I recommend you delete basically everything that follows, mostly because the steps that is going to do this particular script when provisioning your cluster are related with package installation. So let's just remove all that, save the file, and we're just going to copy it to S3. Now, the reason why I recommend that you don't install the packages from the script, and the reason why I recommend you modify the script, let me just upload these. Yeah, so the reason why I recommend you don't, let me just change these. We want to make it public, mostly to make sure that it's accessible for EMR. So we're just uploading this modified script to EMR, not to EMR, to S3 to be used by EMR, and then we want to copy it. And I was saying, like, the reason why I recommend that you don't install the packages, as I was mentioning, from the script is if something fails while the EMR cluster is being created, well, in package installation, it can be quite tricky to troubleshoot. So unless you're trying to automate this process, it's much easier to actually install the packages from RStudio and figure out why they're not installing or whatsoever. So what we want to do is we want to copy the path, and then we'll use this path in the EMR configuration Bootstrap action. So we're gonna do that, configure and add, and then we put in our path to the configured script. Okay, so we have this, and the next what we do want to do, as I mentioned, we don't want to install sparklyr directly from the script. I think it's easier to install it from RStudio, but we do want to install RStudio. So you can select the actual path to the RStudio installer. By the time, likely when you're watching this video, I would probably recommend you get the RPM for 1.3 once RStudio 1.3 is released. But for now, we'll just leave it as it is. Right, that's pretty much it. One last step before we create a cluster is I usually don't upload my EC2 keys. These are only needed if you need to SSH to the machines directly. But since we're installing RStudio, we don't we really don't need to SSH. And then we go ahead and create the cluster. That's pretty much it on the creation step, and we do have to wait a few minutes for the cluster to be created. And just to give you some sense of what to expect, the cluster first gets created as starting, which is just the uh, initial step on the workflow for creating your Spark cluster. Then it will move to bootstrapping, which means executing the bootstrap actions like installing RStudio. And if it's successful, it will move to waiting. Now, while we actually wait for the cluster to finish creating, we do need to configure the security groups. And a security group basically is going to allow you to give access to the cluster. You don't need to give access to the worker nodes, or not generally. I've never had really to configure those, but you do want to configure the master node, which is where RStudio is going to be installed, and also R and potentially other tools. So we want to modify the master group and edit the inbound rules. Now, in this case, I probably already have a few rules that I've used in the past, but we'll do it from scratch. The one that you want to start with, first of all, is RStudio. So we're going to add RStudio's port, which is 8787, and we're going to use our current IP. Now, you could set this potentially to anywhere, which would mean anyone can access the RStudio login page, and if they have a username and password login. But if you're using this for personal purposes, it's so much more secure just to use your current IP. So you save the rules, and that's pretty much it. Now, as you can see, this step has changed to bootstrapping, which means the bootstrap actions are being executed. So it might be the case that RStudio is already installed. Maybe, maybe not. It takes a few seconds to get it installed. So let's try that. And we're going to do 8787. And as you can see, RStudio, it is up and running. And the next step, what we want to figure out is what is the username and password. Now, you should obviously try to change the default username and password, which default to Hadoop. The way of changing this is actually quite easy. All you have to do is specify two more parameters, the user and the password, directly in the Bootstrap action. So what you would do here would be in the Bootstrap action, you would specify two additional parameters, each with a custom user and password. Anyways, for now, we're just going to log in with the Hadoop user. So while we wait for the cluster to be on a waiting state, and also for RStudio to install all the packages and Sparkly R especially, one of the things that I want to mention is how to troubleshoot EMR if this happens to fail. So if the cluster creation happens to fail, the step that you're gonna see here is not waiting, but terminated or terminating. Don't remember exactly, but something around the cluster being terminated. What you want to do in that case is you want to use the logs, and the logs of the cluster are stored under an S3 bucket that we actually configure in the creation step. We just let it to the defaults, which is an automatically generated an automatically generated log location, which is fine, but you can configure it. So what you would do if you see this particular step failing, you can actually quite easily just look at the logs directly from the EMR UI, which is quite useful. In this case, the logs have not yet been refreshed, so there's nothing to see. But let's just pretend that we go back and use one of my previous runs just to get a sense of how the logs look like. So let's just take this one, for instance, and in this particular case, this log might have failed. Let's take a look. So if we look at Bootstrap actions, we can see here our output. And usually the errors will be in the bootstrapping actions. I mean, it's very unlikely that EMR will actually fail to provision the actual machines and the Spark cluster. It is so much more likely that when you're configuring your script, you might forget a step or whatever, and looking at the Bootstrap actions uh, at that particular log should give you a good sense of what went wrong. So you will be able to do that, and then you probably want to open the standard error, or also the standard output. Like both of them can give you kind of like a good sense of what went wrong. Now in this particular case, I don't remember if anything went particularly wrong, but we can also look at the standard output, and we should see here packages, dependencies being installed, and if this were to fail, it usually gives a pretty decent, should give you a pretty decent idea of what went wrong. Now, as you can see here, now we moved from waiting to running, and everything seems to be up and running. It's all good. So we can take a look at our studio and use it as normally. Now, it is the case that we're still installing packages. We installed sparklyr, but sparklyr has also dependencies to basic packages like there's a long list, but even simple things like doing web requests or security related things, all those packages need to be installed by something, which in this case is RStudio. And again, the reason why I like doing it from RStudio is mostly because it's so much easier to troubleshoot the installation process from RStudio and retry and whatever. And especially when you're using the cluster on your own. If you're actually setting a cluster for your organization, it might be a good idea to have it on an actual script, because then anyone can run it if the cluster fails, and it's more reliable to just have it on a script, and you can track changes. You could potentially check into GitHub that script, and anyone would have access to how exactly it's being provisioned and why not. But again, to get started, I'll just use the RStudio to install the packages, and that makes a lot of sense. All right, so yeah, so there's that. There's not much to do at this point in time apart from waiting, except from we can start taking a look at how the connection is gonna look like. We could either use a notebook or an R script. Either way, should be fine. And while it finishes installing, I'll say a few things. Well, first of all, we're gonna include the sparklyr library, which is obvious. But the second step is that we want to connect using not master equal local, which I would hope that many of you are familiar with, since that's usually what we use when testing Spark locally. What we are going to use in this particular case is master equals yarn. This particular connection in EMR is based on yarn clusters, and if you have to read or learn more about clusters, I would go to the R in Spark clusters, and you can find a good overview of what are the available clusters and what particular technologies they use and why not. Yarn should be explained somewhere in here, and Yarn stands mostly for the resource manager for the Hadoop project, and it's still a pretty popular resource manager, so you'll find it on EMR. I don't remember on top of my head what other cloud providers use, but Yarn is definitely one of the popular ones still. Do I want to install the packages? Let's just say no for now, and let's just actually connect from the console. So what do we do? Well, first of all, library sparklyr, and then as our second step, we want to say Spark Connect, and again master equals yarn. Now the other parameter that you need to specify when using EMR is your Spark home. And the Spark home should point to user leave, I believe, and then Spark. That's about it. All we need is to specify the proper Spark home and master equals yarn. Now, this is the bare minimum to get things working. You would obviously want at some point to also specify configuration files. Well, not configuration files, but just configuration in general, and optionally a configuration file with settings like number of executors, how do you handle dynamic allocation, etc. But the bare minimum, this should work in a EMR cluster. So let's just go ahead and connect. And then one of the things that we can try out is opening both the Yarn UI and also the Spark UI, just to make sure that our cluster is up and running. I will say that Yarn requires its own port, and same as Spark. So we will have to configure those particular ports in EMR as well. So let's try to open Yarn, and this will fail because we don't have port 8080. So we can go back to the inbound rules, add rule port 8080, and just to be secure, use our current IP. And then we need to fix the name of the actual redirect. That's something that's not supported on EMR. But you can see here that now we have Yarn running, which is just great. We have our cores available, which in this case is 8, and we have our Spark application running. Now we can do the same with Spark, which is gonna fail. In this case, port 4040. So we can go back to our inbound rules at port 4040. Now this is a redirect port, so that gets us half the way, and then it redirects to port 2888, which we also need to add. So we'll add it as an inbound rule as well. And my current IP. Save the rules, and we fix the URL. You'll have to fix the URL all the time, which is a bit annoying, and there's some workarounds, but I find myself that they're not worth it. So now the Spark UI is loaded, which is great, and then we can do something simple like we're just creating a list of 10 numbers, whatever, and repartitioning it. And we should be able to see this in Spark if we just refresh. It's just a job that is being created and getting executed. But the great thing here is that, as you can see, this is running in EMR, in EC2 machines, pre-configured for you by the EMR service. We also have Yarn up and running, so literally you can scale your jobs as much as needed with a few simple steps that are honestly not that hard to get working. It does take some time to figure out, but hopefully this video will help you there. Now, before we close on this video, maybe the most important thing to mention in this video is that you want to make sure that you turn off and terminate your resources properly. So just from past experience, do not let your clusters running, if you don't have to, because you will incur costs. So what you want to do is, after you're done using a cluster, at least for personal use, make sure you terminate them. There's this termination protection, which is just prevents you from clicking terminate by mistake and potentially losing all your work. So you can just change that to off, and then this becomes enabled, and then you can terminate the cluster, which is gone now, or at least it's terminating. It might take again a couple minutes to actually terminate the cluster. But that's about it. Yeah, definitely don't forget about terminating your cluster. And yeah, hope this was useful. And